Hi, I'm Sarah Weldon with Azure Government, and I'm here today with Indy Crowley from Bridge Partners.
Thank you, Sarah. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Great, it's good to have you. So today we're going to talk about our customer base on Azure Government. And typically with Azure Government, we think of government agencies is what comes to mind. But there's actually an entire industry that supplies government with their goods and services. And so it would be really helpful, since you have experience in this space, to understand a little bit more about what their business model is, what their needs are, and how they need to think about being compliant and operating on a government-compliant IT system.
It'd be my pleasure. Let me first start by outlining the business environment and talking briefly about our customer, the Defense Department. It's likely the largest single buyer of supplies and services in the world, certainly the United States. Its budget in 2017 was roughly $550 billion.
Wow.
And about 3/4 of that actually went to vendors, private companies, both the United States and internationally. And they buy a variety of things from fuel, ships, airplanes, but also hotel services, transportation, and so on and so forth. Basically, about anything that you could buy in the civilian market, the government is also buying.
That makes sense. They're pretty big.
Makes sense. Now, there's a specialized segment of this market when we talk about the defense industrial base I'd like to focus on. And I'm going to loosely call that weapons systems. Now, I'm going to explain that because what I say is a weapons system is not what most people would think. But first, let me characterize two of the business paradigms about weapons systems. The first is that the Defense Department is the sole buyer, or nearly so, which means that they get to pretty much dictate the requirements, and they also have a fair amount of control over the pricing. Now, since they're usually the single or largest buyer, winning that business is important, and if you lose that business, that could be catastrophic for your company, which gives them tremendous leverage in the contracting business. The second thing is, even if they didn't have that leverage, is the contracting business is highly regulated. They have to compete in most cases, and they can enforce their requirements by law, including criminal law that can apply all the way down to the individuals within the company. So it's a very complex process, and it requires highly skilled specialists in order to do that. Now, I think it's fair, since I use the term weapons systems, to say that it doesn't necessarily mean things like guns and ships and airplanes. It includes things like shipping containers. It can include standard commercial products like helicopters that have been slightly modified to meet military needs, and those modifications are considered to make it a military product, which means that that company has to put in specialized controls to ensure that information, which is unique to the militarization of that helicopter, is separately protected. There's a key concept here, and that is that information about a product which is controlled has to be treated as if that is the actual product itself.
Oh, wow.
Very important.
I guess that makes sense, though.
Right. Now, within this so-called weapons systems segment here, it's, again, thousands of companies. Within those thousands of companies, about 2,500 that receive contracts of $6.5 million or more. But the market's larger because a good portion of that business is subcontracted out.
Okay.
In some cases, 97% of it actually goes to subcontractors who provide most of the goods and services. And many of these companies can be quite large, multi-billion-dollar companies in their own right.
And they would still be subject to the same as the prime.
Absolutely. There's this concept called a Flowdown, which means that they're accountable, but the company that owns the contract is fully accountable for the performance of those subcontractors.
I see.
Including the information management.
I see. So you talked a little bit about, well, you have companies where DoD is a large part of their customer base, but you also have cases where, externally speaking, they look like just a general commercial company where they're manufacturing goods that everyday people use.
Exactly.
But there's a segment where they still have to meet these special regulations for government.
Correct. And that's actually their challenge, which is they could be in the primary business of building, use my example, civilian helicopters. But they have to have a specialized contracting group, specialized data management, and so on and so forth in their internal systems to deal with the Department of Defense. It could be as little as 5% of their business, but it might be multi-million dollars, but also the entire company is subject to the penalties for not performing correctly.
And they might be carrying really sensitive data.
No doubt about it.
So let's talk a little bit about the trends facing the industry right now. What kind of pressures are they under with the government?
There's several of them. First is cost. The defense spending in real terms has actually declined over the last half decade, while at the same time, the threats and the missions of the military have greatly expanded. And so there's tremendous pressure from the DoD to provide those goods and services for an expanded mission, but at lower cost. It's really a classic case of doing more for less. The next one is what I call innovation, and that is both the ability to innovate quickly by expanding the scale of your current product or adding new capabilities to that product, but to do it at scale and relatively quickly. And there are technologies such as robotics, artificial intelligence, big data, and so on, I see as absolutely crucial to be able to make those innovative changes fast. The other innovation is actually in the products themselves. The threats have become increasingly complex, and so there's the same pressures to actually incorporate those technologies into the products and the services you're actually providing to the Defense Department. Another important area is what I call being the best vendor in the room. And by this I mean is you're fully qualified to do business with the government overall, particularly cybersecurity, because there's increased threats for cybersecurity, most important of which is the loss of intellectual property. Studies have shown that 60% of small to medium-sized businesses that have a major cyber breach are out of business within 2 years. That's a risk that the government simply cannot afford given the fact that they need those suppliers to be able to deliver for the mission consistently and reliably.
Let's talk about information systems and the data that they hold. Give me a sense of what these companies need the information systems for and what type of data they're handling that applies to government.
It's first important to understand a distinction, because at Microsoft, we're in the business of selling systems that are what I call government systems. In other words, they're going to be operated by the government. And they're actually owned by the government. And so we've built Azure Gov with those agencies in mind, with very high security controls, US-only locations, and various other mechanisms in place to meet those stringent regulatory requirements. But for our div and supply chain, we're looking at those internal systems here. Those are the ones they're using to do business, doing their manufacturing processes. So that means they could have industrial control systems, for example. And they're going to have various back-end systems to do order entry, supply management, and so on and so forth for their own right. You can see how diverse that is. But what they all have in common is they have to protect that information. And that information can exist through that entire process. And you don't always know exactly at what point that information is going to be controlled or sensitive. The government can actually make a determination to say that information is now sensitive after the contract award. And in certain cases, the onus is on the company to make that determination independently. An example is you're designing a new product. You haven't yet even sold it to the government, but you're still responsible for anticipating what the necessary controls are on that data about that product. Now, there's some clear cases where regulatory requirements apply. If you're exporting an item which is restricted, such as for ITAR, or certain export control requirements, then that's U.S. jurisdiction only and access only by U.S. entities.
And an ITAR would be arms goods?
There's a very complex set of export control licenses that governs what those items are. And it's up to the company to understand what those items are, as opposed to the government itself. Today, there is this concept of controlled unclassified information, and the DoD recently enforced a new regulation requiring specific cybersecurity controls and cyber incident reporting requirements. Estimates are at 87% of all contracts beginning in 2018 will enforce that rule.
And
that requires specific controls and specific reporting requirements and specific security assessments performed by the companies themselves across this entire spectrum of goods and services, not just information systems sold to the government. And CUI can cover the gambit from things that are quite obvious to things such as tax information and criminal justice information and so on. So it does require a fair amount of skill and a fair amount of talent, both to understand the information and then to put in the necessary information systems and processes to make sure it's properly identified, transmitted, stored, and deleted at the proper time in accordance with proper security procedures.
So say that I'm one of those commercial companies that also supplies the government, and I'm looking at needing to modernize my IT systems. How could Microsoft help?
Well, Microsoft provides an environment that will help cut down the complexity, plus also provides the skills. So Azure Government, the advantage of Azure Government is it's the one environment today that meets the highest possible standard for unclassified information. More than just the minimum that's required today for a defense industrial base company. It gets back to my concept of be the most qualified vendor in the room. Is you never know when the government's going to impose another requirement, and they can impose it at any time for any reason they want. And so if you're only at the low bar, then you're poorly positioned to get a contract with a higher requirement. And then you don't know when the government's going to impose new requirements generally. So this reduces your risk and uncertainty by being in an environment that you know is ready today and is going to be maintained for the future, and not just at some minimum bar to get by.
Yeah.
And by using Azure Gov, you're tapping into the considerable expertise that Microsoft has to use in order to understand the information management problem. There's considerable expertise here at Microsoft, in the Microsoft government organization in particular, that is dedicated to understanding the security requirements, the information management requirements, and you inherit that when you utilize Azure Government.
So I'm still responsible for my software that I own, create, and how that data is handled. But if I know that I'm handling it in Azure Government's environment, then the underlying environment that I'm hosting all of that on still meets all of those standards. So it would meet DFARS and ITAR and FedRAMP.
And more.
Thank you, Indy. We covered a lot of information today. And if you want to learn more, you can go to any of these pages. A great one to start at is Azure Trust Center. And you can go to azure.com/gov to go to our Azure Government site and learn more about Azure Government. Thank you so much, Indy, for coming today. And I hope our audience learned a lot.
It was truly my great pleasure.